right, to graph a cotangent graph, always think back to your basic cotangent graph. And remember, cotangent is cosine over sine. Sorry, my handwriting is bad for some reason today. Cosine over sine. So wherever the sine equals 0, that's where you're going to have an asymptote. So think of your graph. Where does the sine equal 0? That's your y-coordinate. It's at 0 and at pi. Whoops, let me make pi over here. At 0 and at pi. So those are going to be your asymptotes. Right in the middle of those, which in this case is pi over 2, is where you're going to cross 0, because that's where the cosine equals 0. So 0 over anything is still 0. 0 over 1 is still 0. So that's there. This area right here is your first quadrant, basically, because it's from 0 to pi over 2, right? So that's your first quadrant. And if you think about what the cotangent is in your first quadrant, is it positive or negative?
This one.
It's positive, right? So here's 1. You know at pi over 4 it's going to be 1, because root 2 over 2 divided by root 2 over 2 is positive 1. And at 3 pi over 4, it's going to be negative 1. So those are your 3 points you draw, and then that tells you what your graph is going to do. There's your cotangent graph. Okay, so that's your basic cotangent graph centered at pi over 2 and from 0 to pi. When you have something like this, you want to first find out, did I change anything? Did I change my period? No, I didn't change my period. So my period is still the same. It's still pi, but I did shift it. The horizontal shift is right pi over 2. So instead of being at 0, it's going to be at pi over 2. And instead of being at pi, it's going to be at 3 pi over 2, because I shifted it. Follow?
Mm-hmm.
And now, so in the middle, which would be pi, is going to be where your point is. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't do that yet. So now let's figure out what else we have here. This 1, negative 1 right here, means it shifts down 1. So instead of here, it's going to be here. Calling that negative 1. Got it? And your normal graph would have been over 1 up 1, over 1 down 1, right? But this negative 1/2 flips it and makes it and compresses it.
Okay.
So this point isn't here, this point is here, and this point isn't here, it's there. It got compressed a little bit. So it's going like this.
Okay.
And that's your graph. And to test it, to make sure it works right, plug in some points. Plug in this point right here, which is, if we say this was pi, that would be, let's see, that's 3 pi over 4. So test it, plug in 3 pi over 4 right here. 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 2, which is 2 pi over 4, is pi over 4. And what's the cotangent of pi over 4? 1, right? And what's negative 1/2 times 1 minus 1 equal to? It's equal to negative 1.5. And that's not what I have. I have negative 1/2.
Yeah, that's negative.
Oh, sorry. This isn't 3 pi over 4. This is 3 pi over 4. Right, I did that wrong. This one is not 3 pi over 4. That is 5 pi over 4? 5 pi over 4. So there is negative 1.5. So that worked. All right, that's how you can check it, just to make sure. Check one of your points to make sure you did it right. That's how you do a graph, like tangent graph.